Welcome back. I have an awesome guest today. We're talking with AY. He's the CEO of Parabola. AY, thanks for coming.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me.
So I can't wait to nerd out with you on automation and AI and kind of all things operational. Um, Before we get started, can you just give a quick background on what you do at Parabola and the problems you're solving?
For sure. Me personally, yeah, CEO and founder of Parabola. Parabola, the company, we are the best spreadsheet alternative tool for, we usually call them operators. Sometimes they're like the knowledge point person on your team. Really somebody who's knows all the ins and outs of all the problems in their business. They know where all the gaps are, where all the skeletons are buried. They have tons of ideas for what they or their teams could be doing to move their companies forward, but don't usually have the ability to write code, the technical resources to implement all of their best ideas. So we help them do that without having to get stuck just doing stuff manually in spreadsheets.
Yeah, and we've loved Parabola for a long time. Fully endorse you guys. We use you a lot with our business and with our clients. So um, I'm kind of torn because I don't want your secret to get out, but I also want you guys to do well. So we'll
Awesome.
go.
Well, yeah, we've loved working with you. I think the way you all are using Parabola quite advanced, and I think even if secret gets out, I'm sure you'll be ahead of the pack.
Yeah. Well, good. Let's talk about automation and just general processes to begin with. I would love to get your perspective on how a solopreneur goes to become an entrepreneur. And I think that the difference there is a solopreneur is someone who has a routine, and maybe they're the ones that are pushing all the buttons, doing all those sorts of things, uh, versus someone who is building a team. So a routine versus a team. How do you think about how someone makes that change?
Yeah. Well, I think in some ways, I've gone through a little bit of that process in starting a company, and then we obviously work with variety of businesses ranging from some kind of totally brand new, just one or two people starting an e-commerce brand, up through some of the largest brands that exist. Currently working with companies like Peloton and Uber Freight and Flexport, and so brands and like their logistics partners. Um, so I've seen kind of like a little bit of the life cycle there. I think from my perspective, as I was starting a company and going from doing a little bit of that journey, it's definitely been as constant focusing on maybe like de-risking pieces of the business. Kind of, I think of it as a tranched de-risking of things. And the first things to de-risk are like, does anybody care at all? And can we like capture any attention in the world? And I think especially in the world of e-commerce, even more so than in software, like that's incredibly important. There's so many things competing for everybody's attention. And I think the biggest thing to de-risk is just, can I actually get anybody to pay any attention to me in the first place? I think those are things that a solopreneur, an individual, can test, de-risk, understand like on their own without needing a broader team, and actually can do it much better because you can iterate so fast and you can be so personal and share like what makes you excited and what makes you gets you out of bed in the morning about for us, the software we're working on for our users, the brands that they're building. Um, and then I think over time, maybe it becomes a little bit more like de-risking. Can we do this at increasing scale and have to shift into like, are we capable of building a company of people who are rowing in the same direction and motivated to do this? So I guess like I've thought a little bit about the set of work being the really hands-on, being incredibly close to customers and product and brand as a solopreneur, and then getting into building a company, having to step a little bit away from that, but kind of trying to constantly titrate. Am I still spending enough time with customers and
Yeah.
enough time still in the weeds?
It's one of those things where it's not as if going from a solopreneur to an entrepreneur, you suddenly have more time, right? Like
Right.
things are always moving very quickly, and you're making decisions today and you're building on those decisions tomorrow. And so as you've been building your companies and as you just advice in general, how do you keep a temporary compromise from becoming the status quo?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the default case of what happens is talk about this a lot with new people joining our team. We're around 40 people today, still a relatively small company in the grand scheme of the world. Most of the things we do though are done because that's just the way we've been doing them, and somebody put a little bit of thought into like it's good enough for right now. And our team is pretty forward looking. We think about the grand scale ambition, so we usually put a little bit of thought into, will this like work in the future, but certainly not the maximum amount of like, we know for sure this process will be battle tested, perfect forever. And in fact, like any company that's growing fast enough, it's probably impossible. Like where so many new things are going to happen, so many new things are going to get learned that kind of almost don't want to have something that is going to be perfect in the future, because it means you're not growing and learning enough. So we kind of just try to instill a culture of if you see something that's not correct, just like either proactively change it or at least like ask the question of do we all see this thing here and like should we change it? And don't assume that there's some secret shadow counsel that's like making sure everything will go well. I think at big companies there sometimes is a shadow counsel, but at smaller companies they're like everybody is the shadow counsel.
We are all the Illuminati. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think that like, actually important to like realize that agency about things. So I think like partly just encouraging people to use good judgment when they like most people, especially when you're like really close to a process, you kind of know when something isn't correct and it's like kind of feels wrong, and just kind of giving people the confidence that like, hey, totally fine that we were doing it this way in the past. Let's be willing to try something new. And I think that the best way to do that is to be able to actually communicate about what is the actual process, how do we do the thing, having some sort of, some companies call them SOPs. At a small company, you probably haven't written anything down. It's just implicit in people's heads. But having some sort of base reality, base truth that you're able to talk about and say, here's how we do this thing. Is this good? Is this bad? Like, here's what I want to change. And being able to kind of really show your work to each other, I think is important.
Yeah, my favorite example, just a story, is there was a little girl who was working with her mom, and she was making Sunday roast, and her mom cut off the end of the roast and threw it away. And she asked her mom, like, why'd you do that? It seemed like it was perfect. She's like, I don't know, but my mom did that. And so the next time she was with her grandma, her grandma was making the Sunday roast, and she cut off the end of it and threw it away. And she's like, Grandma, why do you do that? She says, I don't know. That's how my mom did it. And then her great grandma was alive, and so she went to talk to her and said, "Hey, great grandma, I noticed that when you cut off the roast, you throw that away. Just you don't cook the whole thing. Why do you do that?" She says, "The pan was too small." And so there's like these
Yep.
examples out there that like what you're saying. There's these things that people do, and it's been passed on from person to person and time over time. That it's not helpful. And so I think that that's especially important in automation and in kind of thinking about those things.
I think in that example, like the great grandma is kind of like that knowledge point person I was describing at the beginning of a conversation a few minutes ago. She knew like the underlying reason behind a thing, but it wasn't actually documented anywhere. It was locked away in her head, and it required following this chain of thing to actually go talk to another person and say like, "What's this secret information you have in your head about like why we did this thing and what's the context?" In companies, especially in e-commerce companies, there's a lot of turnover, especially in these operational roles. A lot of the time, the person who made that decision not only doesn't work there currently, but hasn't worked there in years and is in multiple new companies now, and maybe not even possible to be tracked down. There's so much of that like siloed knowledge gets lost, and so it's really hard to actually make some of those changes. And so to make a really good change to process, kind of to your initial question, you have to really understand like the why behind things, either the why behind what you want to do now or the why behind that historical decision. And so we encourage our customers constantly to try to write things down, document, get things out in the open. And we've done a lot in our tool to kind of make that happen kind of by default. So if you're using Parabola, ideally, a lot of the documentation kind of happens implicitly, and we create a lot of it behind the scenes for you.
Yeah, that reminds me. When I was at Hubble Contacts and built the supply chain, and then left and did quite a few other things. And there were several other people that rotated through that role. And we've been lucky enough to work with Hubble, via ISBA. And I remember talking with someone and saying, "Oh, yeah, I'd love to know what you guys are doing to forecast." And she's like, "It's your model. It's the one you built 4 years ago.
Right.
We tweaked a little bit, but this is your sheet." And I was like, "Oh my gosh!" Like,
yeah, I was. But before starting this company, I worked as a strategy consultant, and at one point I was consulting for one of the largest healthcare providers in the country, and they had a huge backlog of hundreds of thousands of basically claims of like people who needed like heart surgery, and it was like, "Are you going to pay for this?" And they were trying to figure out the fastest way to like route these different requests through the different support teams who could answer the questions. And so when we came in to try to help improve it, we were like, "So how do you do it currently?" And they're like, "Well, we have this thing called Craigslist that we use to decide like which item to get to which person." And like obviously we were like, that couldn't possibly be true. So we started like asking what they meant. And it turned out there was just a spreadsheet with like a macro in it that nobody knew how it worked. That a guy named Craig like 5 years before had written, and they thought it was hilarious to call it Craigslist. And hundreds and hundreds of thousands of really serious healthcare claims were processing through this Craigslist with an Excel macro that was just a total black box to people.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good story. That's pretty good. When we think about e-commerce company or maybe even healthcare company, right? There are always going to be things that come up, and the first thing you do is you're going to try to add people to it, and you're going to try to take care of it. But at some point, it either becomes too expensive or burdensome, and so you're going to look at, do I automate this away or do I outsource it? What kind of framework do you use to think about whether you're going to outsource something, you're going to look to automate it?
I think probably a few different types of tasks maybe to split up in order to make that decision. So things that are incredibly easy, just connecting two systems, don't need to ever think about it again, would love to never have to touch it again. There's some lighter weight tools in the world that are really good at that. So Zapier and other types of integration platforms I think can really help with quickly connect two tools. Hopefully you never have to touch it again. Don't have to hire anybody special to do it. Things that start to require more specialized context, really unique for you as a company, start to have a lot of complexity baked into the process, start to need something else. So there aren't great existing tools that handle those types of problems. And so I think need to probably then look at that and say, do we have the internal knowledge on our team? Do we know what we want? We're just having trouble actually doing it. Or do we actually have no idea what we want and we need an outside expert who has a lot of pre-existing context? And I think if you don't have anybody on your team who knows how to do the thing truly, then you probably need to get an outside expert to come in and really help you learn how to do the process, stand it up, benefit from the best practices and learnings that someone like you all you work with a lot of brands, and you can cut through so much quick wheel spinning and help them get set up with a process, and then can figure out what to do with it from there, I guess. If you have the existing knowledge internally, you already have somebody who is this, the great grandma who knows how the roast was cut and why. Really just need to empower that person. And so need to figure out hey, how do we get that knowledge that's locked away in their head out into the world around us and having impact? And what we try to do at Parabola is give the ability to, if that person can describe in words, here's why we're doing that thing. It's because the pan wasn't big enough and we need a bigger pan or something. In the e-commerce world, that would be we have three different 3PLs and the contract manufacturer, and they send us data in these different formats, and we have to standardize this one column because the SKU has a prefix in it, so I have to find and replace and remove that prefix. That's something that Parabola can totally handle, and we can bake a lot of that logic into Parabola. And if you can describe it in words, it should be very simple to translate those words into Parabola flow. We're very nice in drag and drop, and we also have a lot of cool AI features that help you increasingly go just from plain language into built Parabola flow. What do you think, though? Someone who does all of that consulting.
Yeah, I think that I agree with what you said. I would also look at not only can someone do it, but what was the last time that they did it? So, for example, whether it is finding a fulfillment center or negotiating a contract, you may have someone on your team who's perfectly capable of doing that, but they may only do that once every 3 or 5 years versus somebody who's doing this, 3 or 4 times a quarter. And so there's just an element that someone who is able to do something is different from, are they sharp? Are they there? Are they able to do it? And so the benefit of outsourcing, I guess I would say, is that, yeah, to some degree, your best practices are going to leak out into the industry, but you're also gaining all the best practices of that outsourced agency into, bringing them into your business. And so I look at that as if I'm looking to catch up, outsourcing makes a lot of sense. If I've got something that is a secret sauce that I don't want anybody else to know about, then that's where I think about automation and trying to build something internally.
Yeah, definitely resonates. I think as I'm sure you know, one of our most common questions we get from customers is hey, how do other people do this thing? I couldn't be the first company to do this. Why does it feel like I'm reinventing the wheel here? We started trying to connect people behind the scenes just to talk one-on-one. We've started hosting some dinners just of operators who can get together and share stories. And I thank you for coming to some of those and sharing some of those stories. And I'm sure that when you're working with companies, you're able to also connect a lot of those dots and say, hey, I've seen this 20 times and actually don't reinvent the wheel here, or this does feel pretty special, and like you should lean in and like treat this as a unique place for you to innovate.
Yeah, and it's something you mentioned earlier about, is the thing that you're working on a strategic advantage, right? So, if you're doing something that is your secret sauce. So I think about, I had a great conversation with someone from Rent the Runway at one of your dinners, and the reverse logistics piece is the secret sauce. Like you don't
Yep,
outsource that, but like accounting, like parcel negotiations, like those are the like, yeah, you can outsource that and be just fine.
totally. I think that part of the secret sauce also frequently are use cases that are really dynamic, where the requirements change really often. And so, like when we think about the best Parabola use cases, obviously we're not the only automation tool, but I think we're really good at this specific domain of tasks where it's really bespoke. So there's no off the shelf solution you can buy. It's like pretty complex and logical, where there's the lighter weight tools aren't going to help you, and there's a lot of nuance you have to bake into this process. But like most importantly, that they're really dynamic. Your use cases are changing day to day or week to week. If it's our e-commerce brands, it's because they're swapping new vendors in and out. They're like being pretty iterative on something that is like their core competency. Some of our like logistics partner customers are kind of creating client specific workflows. And in either case, they're doing things where there's a business person who's the total subject matter expert of what that use case should look like, and they want to be able to tinker and change and double check on a weekly basis. Those are obviously hard things to outsource because you want the person who is directly responsible within the company to like be just laser focused on constantly tweaking those levers.
Yeah, and that's really where the conversations around augmenting, right, and documentation and empowering that person that you talked about.
Yep.
So if I'm a brand and I'm thinking through kind of my current status, and there's a lot of things that are manual, and I'm not quite sure if I'm ready. I mean, a lot of times people think that any sort of automation is, I have to, one, be a very big company, and I have to have a huge budget in order to do that. How do you approach automation? How does someone take a baby step toward automating a manual process?
Yeah, when we talk with operations folks at these e-commerce brands, I'm sure you encounter this as well. They're always incredibly busy. I think that's always been the case, and what I've seen at least since the past year or so, that's really increased. Where companies are not hiring as many operations folks, but they're expecting them to support more and more revenue and do more and more stuff. And so I don't know of a single operations person at an e-commerce brand that's doing even moderately well that doesn't feel incredibly busy. And some of them have described it almost as like trapped in quicksand, where they have to work incredibly hard every single day just to kind of get done the baseline things that they were hoping to get done to keep the business afloat. And they can barely even like dream of, let alone actually do anything to like make their lives better on a given day. And so when if you think about a really any technology thing, like automating some of your work in this case, even documenting the work before you automate it. If you have to do it all at once as one big bang, it's going to be such a daunting project that it never happens. And it's kind of how teams implement NetSuite. Sometimes they try to do one big bang, and it takes multiple years, and it usually fails a few times before they finally get it right. It's an agonizing process. And I think much better is to just do things piecemeal ad hoc. Try to make your day 1% better each day, and that compounds incredibly quickly. And if you can just free up 10 minutes or 20 minutes and start actually getting some of that time back, and then you can start to say, like, actually, I freed up enough mental headspace that I'm not only making my existing work better, but I have my list of 1,000 other things that I know that like would be so awesome if only I had the time, and I can actually start doing a few of those things. And what gets me really excited about working in this space is like we can actually get the hundreds of millions of people who have these ideas but don't know how to code to get those ideas out of their head and out into the world around them, and kind of have that same experience of what it's like to be an engineer. If I have an idea and I give a life of its own, and I don't have to manually run around supporting it every day.
Yeah, that's helpful. I usually approach this from like an ECRS framework. I don't know if you're familiar with that acronym, but stands eliminate, combine, rearrange, and simplify. And it's something I picked up from just working in the factory for a little bit. But the basic idea is you make a list of everything you're doing, and you just start see what you can just stop doing. And I remember when I was at Unilever, the group that I was in charge of had a lot of reporting and things that they were just supposed to do. And I remember one week I was just like, guys, let's just not send this out. Like, it takes a lot of time, and we don't know if anybody looks at it because we don't hear anything back. So let's just stop. And we stopped like 10 things that week, And there was like one where people were like, hey, where is this? I was expecting this report. I'm like, oh, sorry, we're late. Here it is. And so we scrambled, but we were able to eliminate like 8 or 9 things that were taking time. Yeah, I mean, you go to eliminate, then you look to combine different things. So if I'm already working on one idea, can I just address it a little bit so I can include those together? Reassigning it, so giving it to somebody else, outsourcing it, automating it, or simplifying. So that's a kind of framework I've always used.
Yeah, and kind of similar to how software engineers work, right? Like they get really excited to delete lines of code and to simplify things, and there's this constant effort to reduce complexity in a system so it's easier to hold it all in your head. And I think it's like a very similar pattern. And I think at core philosophy of mine and of ours as a company is that operations folks actually like have engineering mindsets. They basically are another engineering team. They're just doing kind of like human engineering problems. And should totally approach them the exact same way software engineers approach technical challenges.
Yeah.
I think also like at the core of what you were starting to say there, you have to write things down first. You have to get things out in the open and documented, and like everybody kind of saying, yes, I agree that this is what we're all talking about, so that you can then start to optimize. I think once you do that, a lot of those optimizations become really obvious. And a lot of the challenges that I see a lot of companies have is they kind of have like everybody has a fuzzy 75% vision in their head that's a slightly different 75% than everybody else. And it's kind of hard to actually have a really productive set of conversations about what are we going to do, how are we going to move things forward if it's just kind of this like fuzzy, incomplete picture.
Yeah, completely agree. The first step is probably the hardest, is just writing it down. Because I think,
Totally.
so many people look at something and say, well, what do you want? Like, I don't know, but this ain't it. You're like, all right, well, we can't really work off of that. So
Yep.
let's start, pushing through it. One of the things that I'll encounter quite a bit, or there's some pushback people have, is when it comes to automating something, um, there's a risk that the business can become brittle, and you can kind of set this web of automations. I mean, Zapier kind of comes to mind, where you can do a lot with that tool. But as
Yep.
soon as an API changes or something in your business changes, then suddenly all of these automations are no longer valid, and you may or may not have the person who knows how to fix them available to go fix it. And so, how do you think about, or how would you recommend to a business that they automate certain things without becoming brittle and putting the business
Yeah.
at risk that way?
I think about this again, same thing I just said about engineering best practices. The world of software engineering has 40 or 50 years of having really figured a lot of these architecture patterns out of here's how we build systems that scale and are durable and work really well. And there's no reason to not borrow really as many of those things as possible. And so partly, I think like any operator, listening to this, using a set of these tools can try to use those patterns themselves. And then like we as a company have tried to build a lot of those in kind of by default into our tool, so that just by using our tool, you end up kind of almost like accidentally doing the right
What are some
software engineering
examples
the
of
right way.
things that you guys have built in?
Yeah, so I think like if you think about like the way a software engineering team collaborates and like splits up work, you want to separate concerns a lot. So you want to make sure that data fetching happens in one place, some of the like logic and business logic, whatever, happens in a different place. And ideally, it like flows in a way that's very predictable, where there aren't in engineering world you call it like side effects that are happening to the outside world like midway through a process happening. So it's very predictable. It can rerun every time the same way. Um, in Parabola world, that two like important things happen there. Like one is our flows are basically like a functional tree. They like start at the beginning and they run through this process. And like other workflow tools, you probably could think of it looks like a flow chart and like lets you follow a process. And we're able to go back and rerun sets of flow if anything like breaks or there's an error. Like it's very easy to go back and like see what happened and trace that all through. We also help you split apart data fetching and cleaning up either at the beginning of a flow or even in a totally separate flow. So that you can have one consistent place where you fetch data from Shopify or ingest data from your 3PL or parse an invoice that's like coming from a manufacturer separately from where you like host a lot of your logic. So like compartmentalizing and then being able to reuse those components in different places. So you can say I fetch data and clean up from Shopify data in this specific way. And every time I want to like use that same piece of data, I want to use the exact same logic for how I clean up that data. So there's no inconsistencies. And then we hire a new analyst who has some ideas for how to make it better, rather than having to go across the 1,000 different places where all those little bits of logic might exist. Ideally, there's one place where you make the change and it changes everywhere. Really important way software engineers work, right? So that they can maintain one thing and it has impacts everywhere. ideally you build your systems in that kind of like modular type of way. The other important one I think is testing. And so to the extent possible, software engineers call it unit testing is probably the simplest one to think about, where every single time you're doing a piece of logic, there's something you know about the world that you're assuming to be true that's like baked into that logic working correctly. And for operators working on spreadsheets, it can really just be as simple as I'm expecting this column to exist in this data set. And if it doesn't, something happened. Either the data set changed, the data set's broken, they didn't even send me the data. Something's happening if that like skew column doesn't exist. And also like all the downstream stuff is going to break if that thing doesn't exist. And so ideally build validation checks that are like, hey, like if this thing doesn't exist, like stop and send me an email like, hey, that something's broken. I need to come take a look at it. And knowing that your automations will give you that type of alerting and tell you if something is broken also instills a lot of trust of like, oh, like I can actually be hands-free because I know if something breaks, it'll like let me know and I don't have to be really like anxious checking every 10 minutes that it's working correctly.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I kind of chuckle as you're talking about software engineering and things coming together. A lot of conversations been had in the last year and a half about AI taking over everything, and you're unleashing the engineers, and all this software is going to take over the world. What is the practical application of AI and automation in general?
We think quite important. I think it's really important in every industry, everywhere. I think pretty optimistic that it'll make a lot of new things possible. I think in this world of automation, when we're talking to certainly we're talking to one of our larger customers who's already tried a lot of things, but even surprisingly, some of our smaller like up and coming brands, they've already automated the really easy, obvious things. They're not naive about all the tools that exist. Like they usually are trying a lot of these things, and they've already automated the easy to automate things. And the things that are left are kind of what I described. The things that are really bespoke, they're really complex, and they change really often. And as a result, there's like just a lot of like manual attention that's needed, like subjective judgment. I need to double check that this like document was parsed correctly. I need to change this thing every few days, so I'm just not going to even bother automating. I'm just going to do it manually. Like something that requires enough of a human in the loop. I think the newer AI models have enough ability to handle like dynamic, subjective, non-normalized data that can actually take a decent amount of that logic and bake that into at least like a prompt to one of these large language models if you are careful and do it in a way that has enough guardrails that it doesn't make things up. Hallucinate, I think, is the technical term for it. And so I think what it enables us to do is to start actually chipping away at some of those things that people maybe historically resigned to just being forever manual, but actually can increasingly hand those off and treat some of these models kind of like a junior analyst on your team who maybe needs a lot of like explicit instruction of what to do, but still can handle a little bit of like dynamic task that gets thrown their way.
That's interesting. I am a very big proponent of like, let's use it, but at the same time, it seems that it's not quite there. I don't know if you saw this lawsuit that happened with Air Canada, but basically what they had is they had an AI that was answering all the customer service tickets, and basically it portrayed itself as a human and those sorts of things. And they had a customer that reached out and asked about what their bereavement policy was. Effectively, like, hey, if I have a funeral that's coming up that I got to go to, can I get a refund? And the AI decided that it was going to create its own policy and basically say, oh yeah, if you're going for this sort of death in the family, then like we'll refund your ticket if this thing happens, and so that. So the person purchased it, and then thinking that they could potentially get a refund if they could go on a trip. And then they went to reach out to get the refund, and Air Canada's like, well, hold on, like, no, you can't do this. And they end up losing the lawsuit. And a large part was their fiction or their perspective was that this AI unit was separate from Air Canada. And it was something that, we're not responsible for what it says, but at the same time, we want it to do everything. And so, how do you think about those, reconciling those two things where, yes, we want to allow it to do those aspects for us that appear that it can make our lives really awesome, but then have these unintended consequences where, it actually ends up being worth more trouble than it's solving for.
Yeah, I feel that's such a perfect example of a few of like the challenges, but I think also like related opportunities. I think the overarching thing I would initially say is just a human could do that too. So if you have a big support team, uh, you know, weird things happen all the time like that, where people don't perfectly follow the script and they make they hear somebody with a serious emotional problem and they're trying to meet them from a place of empathy and do something nice. And I think that
Yeah.
happens regularly. You have to set up systems to be able to double check things or give people freedom.
Yeah, to be specific about what it was is they were claiming that the AI agent was an independent
Yeah,
contractor of the
right,
company.
exactly, right,
They
exactly.
weren't liable for those actions, which I thought was
Right,
clever.
which I think like if it was a person, would be a pretty hard thing to advocate for because they were hiring and deploying that person to do their customer support and like
Right.
put them interface them into their website. So I think like probably there's already a lot of like from a legal perspective, like should probably treat it kind of the same thing. To be able to do that as a company though, to be able to put an AI agent on your support and trust it to work kind of in an interface with you the way a human does, I think you need to build trust in the same way you build trust with a human, which is understanding its decision making process and how it works and what it's motivated by. And when you're working with another person, especially if we pull this back into like e-commerce world, one of the best ways to communicate is to just like show your work, make some decisions together. Hey, how do we do this thing? Oh, like let's just like I'll walk you through it. Like we'll do it once or twice together, and then we'll either know that we're talking about something totally different, and we can like hash that out, or we can be totally content that we actually are like looking at reality the same way, and I can now trust that you're going to go off and do it on your own together. And I think that's like a very trust battery charging activity to do. And
Yeah.
like from early, I don't know, like math classes when we were all younger, like everything was always about showing your work, like prove that you know what you're actually doing. I think that's such a core way that humans collaborate, and I think it's also a really important core way that AI needs to be able to collaborate with humans as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I guess like as you're a founder thinking about the right level of AI to implement into your business, what are some guardrails that you would say like just because somebody has an application that will do a chatbot or will have
Yep.
AI with it doesn't necessarily mean that they've worked out all the bugs or that's something you should introduce. And so how do you think about the criteria that a independent business owner should take towards some of
Mm.
these AI enabled tools?
So for us, I don't know that this is a general advice that should work for everybody. But for us, we like to make it really clear any of our features that are powered by AI that they are powered by AI. Partly because I think for some people that's exciting, and partly because some people want to stay away and not use those things. And at least it sets some expectations of like what's happening. So I think in that airline example, if they had specifically said that it was an AI chatbot, maybe person would have reacted, interfaced differently or double checked or something might have been different. I'm not sure. For us, at least, we like to communicate like what's happening. Um, the other thing we like to do is we like to think about so like we're processing a lot of data, and you build a process in Parabola and you expect it to run the same way every time. And one of the things I was saying is, as an engineer, you want to build code that is repeatable and durable, and it always does the same thing every time. It's usually called being deterministic. Uh, and so we want to make sure that our flows are still deterministic. And AI models, given that they're handling of subjectivity, aren't usually perfectly deterministic. So we try to separate how much we're using AI for helping you figure out what to do, how to build something, configure something in an easier way without having to use all of your every little drop down and configuration yourself, versus when the flow is actually calculating, um, making sure that it stays deterministic. And so those are we try to like communicate when you're in each of those modes. And so I think as you think about something in an e-commerce business, when you're dealing with actual payments and processing somebody's credit card or doing a refund or something, if you want that to be automated, you need to be incredibly confident that it's going to happen correctly. I think kind of similar to this airline example. Uh, if it's just routing you to the right person, triaging something, not actually charging your credit card, it's obviously a lot easier to trust an AI to at least get you part of the way there if somebody's going to like be able to double check it in the future.
Yeah. I mean, I just am fascinated, as you can tell, with these sorts of questions that we're wrestling with, because on the one hand, a computer is going to be able to do the same thing for longer. I remember, being at my first contact lens factory, and there was a difference between the factories that had rows of 20 or 30 people that were literally looking at every contact lens under a microscope and
Yep.
inspecting for defects, and the ones that had a visual machine that was doing the same thing. And, you know, for that sort of thing, having something that's highly repeatable, highly specialized, that needs to go on forever and ever made sense with that element. But it's almost as if there's a piece here where if it is easy, right, then it's
Yep.
like, okay, we'll have a person do that. If it becomes a lot of it, then maybe we want a machine to do it. But if it's super sensitive, then we want a person to do it again. And so we just kind of have to figure that out as in each of our businesses.
Yeah, I think the answer to all those questions is changing on like a weekly basis as new things come out. And I think as a business owner, operator, whatever, dealing with like, should I be deploying things in a more AI focused way or doing things in a more manual way? Um, Need to kind of just be experimental and try. And I think like the way we are trying to build this all into Parabola is in a way where everything that AI is doing is it's showing its work behind the scenes. And so our tool we think of as the best way. You've obviously heard me talk about documentation showing your work a lot. We think of it as the best way for without any AI involved, for one human to uh, build out a process, document it, and like communicate to somebody else. Here's how this thing works. Here's why I'm making all these decisions. Here's where all the data is coming from. We obviously also do the automation and data processing at the same time. But I think the most important part of the problem, our customers value the most, is actually the having it all out in the open, and I can see how it's working, and we can collaborate, we can find issues, and maybe there are things that we've been doing wrong all along that a lot of our customers will find when they first come to Parabola. They're like, oh, we were actually doing this wrong in spreadsheets for years, and for the first time now, we just realized that because we got it out into the open and we fixed a pretty important, we saved $40,000 from the way we were like auditing our freight provider. So I think it's important to show your work and collaborate with other people. And so any AI feature we're building in, we're making sure is showing its work in just the same way to the user. So ideally, we've created a tool that is great for humans to share their work with other humans, and it's exactly the same set of things that make it really great for an AI to share its work with a human. And I think as you're being experimental, trying, let's apply a little bit of AI to this type of thing. For us, a lot of the time, that's like parsing a PDF. Let's like see if we can parse that thing without having to have a human in the loop. Can just kind of try and be experimental and see if it works, and like do it in parallel for a few times. And if it works really consistently, you can start to trust it, just like you could trust an analyst you hire to your team after you've seen them do the right thing 5 or 10 times in a row.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Where do you think the world of automation inside businesses is going in the next 18 months and 5 years?
So I think obviously this gets into increasingly self-serving territory, but to me, today we live in a world, or maybe a year ago we lived in a world where most of the ability to tell a computer to do what you want it to do without you having to be manually typing as fast as you can on your keyboard, it was kind of reserved to software engineers. And it's a tiny fraction of a percent of the world who knows how to code and can take the ideas in their head, get them out into the world, and they have a life of their own as a result. And most people, and especially as we're talking about operations, you folks at e-commerce brands, operate much more, and the amount of impact they can have on the world is how fast they can type into Excel, how quickly they can send emails, how frantically they can call each other. And you're kind of still being like a worker with manual instruments. You have to the amount you work is linearly correlated with how much impact you have on the world. And what's so exciting about technology tools in general is the ability to have a really asymmetric impact where I can do a few things and have hugely magnified impact on the world. The thing that gets me most excited to be working on Parabola in the first place is helping roll out that ability to as many people as possible and not having it gate kept behind kind of really jargony code-based things and complicated technical systems, but really just getting to, if you have a great idea in your head, get it out into the world around you. We just launched a new rebrand of our website that's trying to elevate some of this messaging and really orienting it around like, if you can think it, you can build it. And so like, if you have an idea, that should be the hard part. The hard part is knowing what to do. The easy part should be like putting it out into the world. So I think the future looks like, the good version of the future at least, looks like as many people as possible, ideally everybody, who has those awesome ideas, being able to just try them and put them out into the world and see if they have impact, see if they create economic value. If they do, ideally they're having really accelerated career trajectory. They're getting promoted for having helped to move their whole company forward with some of these ideas they put into action. And having more of a relationship with work that software engineers have today, where they have this huge asymmetric economic impact per like hour they work. And I think everybody in the world can get to a place where they have that same amount of impact. I think that looks like a really exciting future. Way more economic productivity happens when everybody can have that hugely leveraged impact. So I think it's kind of like only a good thing as more people get access.
Yeah, I love that. As you were talking about people's impact basically being how much they can type into a computer, I remember going back and when we were building out customer service teams, one of the interview criteria was what's your words per minute? How fast can you type?
Yeah, totally.
Because that's what we were doing. And so we've come a long way in a very short period of time where I think those interpersonal relationships and kind of the way that you're thinking about things is the important part versus maybe some of the mechanical aspects of work.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that only becomes more true as higher leverage tools become available. And I think I think it's a very rosy version of the future. I think the only bad version of the future is those things continue to be gate kept and most people not having access, because that's when people start to wonder, how do I fit into the future? I think that's true as a person. It's also true as a company. I think one of the coolest trends we've been seeing at Parabola over the past year is a lot of even our most legacy customers, 100-year-old family-owned businesses, are realizing this is the year they need to invest in technology if they want to make sure they're part of the future. And it's no longer a hypothetical future problem to deal with later. It's we need to decide now if we're going to be an active part of the future. I think that's a really cool. It's cool that so many people are realizing that and grappling with that and opting into hey, we're actually going to leapfrog all of the past few years of deferring it and actually just start to be a really tech-enabled business.
What's pushing them over the edge? Is it just ChatGPT being in the zeitgeist?
Yeah, I think it's probably a couple things. I think the biggest one is that it's kind of without even necessarily knowing all of the implications, just the world seems to be moving increasingly fast. So I think that scares people. And I think that fear is oh, wow, this is happening now. It's much more tangible than this hypothetical, a few companies use technology and do well. I think there's probably also some proof, actually happening. There are businesses that are, being more tech enabled that are massively more profitable, growing much faster, harder and harder to compete with. And I think that also feels pretty tangible when you are already having these operators who are typing as fast as they can, as many words per minute as they can, and you're asking them to do a little bit more. It's oh man, that's such a hard ask to ask of somebody. It's so much easier to say, actually, we've invested in some technology that's going to help you do more with the same amount of time that you spend today.
Yeah, that's great. Alex, this has been a lot of fun. I think we got to cut it off and get back to work. If people want to reach out to you or learn more about Parabola, what's the right way to do that?
Check out our website. We just launched a brand new one just a few days ago that I'm pretty excited about. So that's parabola.io. And I'm available on Twitter, LinkedIn. Just send me a DM and I'll get back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being on.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.